Every time she glanced up from her notes, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. It made her uneasy, but she didn't know how to address it without seeming rude. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Mr. Tunde finally stood up and stretched. "I think we've done enough for tonight," he said, his voice warm and friendly. "Let me give you a ride home." Ada's heart skipped a beat. She wanted to refuse, but didn't want to seem ungrateful or disrespectful. After all, he was her boss. The sun was setting over the bustling streets of Ibadan, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The city was alive with the sounds of honking cars, street vendors calling out their wares, and children laughing as they played. In the middle of it all was a tall building where people worked hard every day. Inside that building was a company called Bright Horizons, and among its many workers was a young woman named Ada. Ada was 26 years old, with smooth brown skin and a smile that could light up any room. She had grown up in a small village called Odoi, but moved to Ibadan after graduating from university. She was proud of her job as an administrative assistant at Bright Horizons. It wasn't her dream job, but it paid well enough to support her family back in the village. Ada had always been hardworking and respectful. Her colleagues liked her because she was kind and always willing to help. But there was one person in the office who made her nervous, her boss, Mr. Tunde. Mr. Tunde was the managing director of Bright Horizons. He was tall, dark, and had an air of confidence that made everyone respect him. He wore expensive suits and drove a sleek black car that always caught Ada's eye when he parked it outside the office. Mr. Tunde was married to a beautiful woman named Funmi, and they had 2 young children. Ada admired him from afar but never thought much about it. After all, he was her boss and a married man. She focused on her work and tried to stay out of trouble. One Friday evening, after most of the staff had left for the weekend, Ada stayed back to finish some paperwork. She wanted to impress Mr. Tunde by showing him how dedicated she was to her job. As she worked quietly at her desk, she heard footsteps approaching. "Ada," came a deep voice behind her. She turned around quickly and saw Mr. Tunde standing there with his hands in his pockets. "Good evening, sir," she said nervously. "Good evening," he replied with a small smile. "You're still here? It's late." "Yes, sir," Ada said, looking down at her papers. "I just wanted to finish this report before Monday." Mr. Tunde nodded and walked closer to her desk. "That's very impressive," he said. "You're one of the most hardworking people in this office." Ada felt her cheeks grow warm at his compliment. "Thank you, sir," she said softly. For a moment, there was silence between them as he looked at her intently. Then he said something that surprised her. "You know, Ada," he began slowly, "I've noticed how dedicated you are. You're different from the others." Ada didn't know how to respond. She felt flattered but also uncomfortable under his gaze. "Thank you, sir," she said again, trying to keep her voice steady. Before she could say anything else, he reached out and placed his hand gently on hers. "Ada," he said in a low voice, "I want us to be friends, close friends." Her heart started racing as she pulled her hand away quickly. "Sir, I don't think that's appropriate," she stammered. Mr. Tunde chuckled softly and stepped back. "Relax," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm just saying you're special." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Ada feeling confused and uneasy. Over the next few weeks, Mr. Tunde began paying more attention to Ada than ever before. He called her into his office for meetings that didn't seem necessary and found excuses to talk to her during lunch breaks. At first, Ada tried to ignore it, but it became harder as time went on. One day during lunch hour, Ada confided in her closest friend at work, Sade. "Sade," she whispered as they sat together in the staff canteen, "I think Mr. Tunde is acting strange around me." Sade raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "He keeps calling me into his office for no reason," Ada explained nervously. "And sometimes I feel like he's looking at me in a way that makes me uncomfortable." Sade frowned thoughtfully before leaning closer. "Ada," she said quietly, Be careful, oh. Men like him can be dangerous. Ada nodded, but didn't know what to do about the situation. Things took a turn one evening when Mr. Tunde asked Ada to stay back after work for an important meeting about a new project. I need your input on this, he told her with a charming smile. Reluctantly, Ada agreed and stayed behind while everyone else left for the day. As they worked together in his office late into the night, Ada couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioner and the occasional sound of papers shuffling. Mr. Tunde sat across from her, his eyes fixed on her as she explained her ideas for the project. You're very talented, Ada, he said suddenly, interrupting her mid-sentence. His voice was calm but carried an intensity that made her pause. Thank you, sir, she replied, lowering her gaze to avoid his piercing stare. He leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. You don't have to call me sir all the time, you know, he said with a small smile. We're working as a team here. Ada nodded nervously. Okay. Tunde, she said hesitantly, the name feeling strange on her tongue. He smiled wider, clearly pleased. That's better. The conversation drifted back to work, but Ada couldn't help noticing how close he was sitting to her. Every time she glanced up from her notes, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. It made her uneasy, but she didn't know how to address it without seeming rude. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Mr. Tunde finally stood up and stretched. I think we've done enough for tonight, he said, his voice warm and friendly. Let me give you a ride home. Ada's heart skipped a beat. She wanted to refuse, but didn't want to seem ungrateful or disrespectful. After all, he was her boss. Okay, she said quietly, gathering her things. The drive home was quiet at first, with only the soft sound of music playing from the car radio. Ada stared out of the window, watching the city lights blur past as she tried to calm her racing thoughts. You're very special, Ada, Mr. Tunde said suddenly, breaking the silence. She turned to look at him, startled by his words. What do you mean? He glanced at her briefly before returning his eyes to the road. You're different from anyone else I've worked with, he said softly. You're hardworking, intelligent, and beautiful. Ada felt her cheeks heat up at his compliment. She didn't know how to respond. Tunde, she began cautiously, but he interrupted her. I know what you're thinking, he said quickly. But I just wanted you to know how much I appreciate you. Ada nodded slowly, but didn't say anything else for the rest of the ride. When they arrived at her apartment building, Mr. Tunde parked the car and turned to face her. Thank you for tonight, he said sincerely. You've been a great help. You're welcome, Ada replied quietly as she opened the door to step out. Ada, he called after her softly. She paused and turned back to look at him. Don't forget what I said, he added with a small smile before driving away into the night. Ada stood there for a moment, watching his car disappear down the street. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, confusion, excitement, guilt, all tangled together in a way that made it hard for her to think clearly. The next morning at work, everything seemed normal, at least on the surface. But Ada couldn't shake off the memory of their conversation in the car or the way he had looked at her. As she walked into the office canteen during lunch break, she spotted Sade sitting at their usual table and hurried over to join her. Sade, she whispered urgently as soon as she sat down. I need to talk to you. Sade looked up from her plate with a concerned expression. What's wrong? It's about Mr. Tunde, Ada began hesitantly. Sade raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything, waiting for Ada to continue. He gave me a ride home last night after we worked late on that project, Ada explained quickly. And he said some things that made me feel uncomfortable. What kind of things? Sade asked sharply. Ada hesitated before answering. He called me special and beautiful. Sade's eyes widened in shock. Are you serious? Yes, Ada replied nervously. I don't know what to do. Sade leaned closer and lowered her voice. Ada, you need to be very careful with this man, she warned. He may seem charming now, but men like him can ruin your life if you're not careful." "I know," Ada said quietly, feeling a knot of anxiety form in her stomach. For the rest of the day, Ada tried to focus on her work and avoid any unnecessary interactions with Mr. Tunde. But it wasn't easy. Every time she saw him walking through the office or heard his voice in a meeting, she felt a mixture of fear and excitement that left her feeling conflicted. As days turned into weeks, Mr. Tunde's behavior became more persistent. He found excuses to call Ada into his office for private meetings and often lingered near her desk during lunch breaks. The other employees began to notice his unusual attention toward her, including Sarah. One afternoon, Sarah approached Ada in the hallway with a smug look on her face. "So, what's going on between you and Mr. Tunde?" Sarah asked casually, but with an edge of malice in her tone. "Nothing," Ada replied quickly, feeling defensive. Sarah smirked knowingly. "Sure, it's nothing," she said sarcastically before walking away. Ada felt panic rising in her chest as Sarah's words echoed in her mind. If rumors started spreading around the office about her and Mr. Tunde, what would happen? The days following Sarah's comment felt heavy for Ada. She tried to focus on her work, but the whispers in the office and the pressure of Mr. Tunde's attention made it difficult to concentrate. Each time she saw him, her heart would race, torn between excitement and fear. One afternoon, as Ada was organizing files at her desk, she felt a presence beside her. She looked up to see Mr. Tunde leaning casually against her cubicle wall. "Ada," he said with a warm smile, "can you come to my office for a moment? I need your help with something important." Her stomach twisted at the request. "Sure, Tunde," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. As they walked to his office, Ada's mind raced with thoughts of what might happen next. She knew she should be cautious, but there was a part of her that was drawn to him, his charm, his confidence, the way he made her feel special. Once inside his office, Mr. Tunde closed the door behind them, creating an intimate atmosphere that made Ada's heart pound even louder. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. Ada took a seat, trying to appear calm as he leaned back in his chair and studied her. "I've been thinking about our last conversation," he began. "I really appreciate everything you do for this company." "Thank you," Ada said softly, feeling both flattered and nervous under his gaze. "I want you to know that I see great potential in you," he continued. "You could go far in this company if you keep working hard." "Thank you, Tunde," she replied, feeling a mix of pride and apprehension. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk. "But I also want to make sure you're happy here. If there's anything bothering you or if you need support." Before he could finish his sentence, there was a loud knock on the door. Startled, both Ada and Mr. Tunde turned to see Sarah standing there with a smug expression on her face. "Mr. Tunde, the meeting is about to start," she announced loudly, clearly interrupting something private. "Thank you, Sarah," Mr. Tunde replied coolly as he straightened up in his chair. He glanced back at Ada with an apologetic look before turning his attention back to Sarah. "Can we discuss this later?" he asked Ada. "Of course," Ada said quickly, feeling a wave of relief wash over her as she stood up and left the office. As she walked back to her desk, Ada couldn't shake off the feeling of frustration mixed with relief. Sarah had interrupted what could have been an important conversation, one that might have clarified their relationship or set boundaries. Later that day, as Ada sat at her desk working on a presentation for an upcoming meeting, she felt someone hovering nearby. She looked up to find Sarah watching her with an expression that made her uneasy. "What do you think you're doing with Mr. Tunde?" Sarah asked bluntly. "I'm just doing my job," Ada replied defensively. "Oh really?" "Because it looks like you're trying to get special treatment," Sarah shot back, crossing her arms over her chest. Ada felt anger rise within her. "That's not true. He's my boss." "Sure," Sarah said with a smirk. "But don't think I won't tell everyone about your little friendship if you don't watch yourself." "What are you talking about?" Ada exclaimed, feeling cornered. "You know exactly what I mean," Sarah replied with a sneer before walking away. Ada felt shaken by Sarah's threat. She knew that if rumors started spreading about her and Mr. Tunde being more than just colleagues, it could ruin not only her reputation but also her career at Bright Horizons. That evening after work, Ada called Sade to talk about everything that had happened. "Sade, I'm really worried," Ada said when Sade answered the phone. "What happened?" Sade asked immediately. "It's Sarah, she's threatening me," Ada explained quickly. "She thinks something is going on between me and Mr. Tunde." Sade sighed heavily on the other end of the line. "You need to be careful around both of them," she warned. "Sarah is not someone who will keep quiet if she feels threatened." "I know," Ada replied desperately. "But I don't want to lose my job over this." Sade paused for a moment before speaking again. "You need to set boundaries with Mr. Tunde too. If he's making you uncomfortable or if it seems like he wants more than just a professional relationship, you have to be firm." The next day at work, Ada decided it was time to take control of the situation. When Mr. Tunde called her into his office again for another meeting, she took a deep breath before stepping inside. "Tunde," she began cautiously as he closed the door behind them, "I think we need to talk about our relationship." He looked surprised but intrigued as he leaned back in his chair. "What do you mean?" "I appreciate all your support and guidance at work," she said carefully, choosing her words wisely. "But I want to make sure we keep things professional." Mr. Tunde frowned slightly but nodded slowly as if considering her words carefully. "I understand where you're coming from," he replied finally. "But I want you to know that my feelings for you are genuine." Ada's heart raced at his admission, but also filled with dread at what it could mean for her future at Bright Horizons. "I just want us both to be clear about where we stand," she continued firmly but gently. He studied her for a moment before responding with sincerity in his eyes, "I respect your feelings and appreciate your honesty." Relief washed over Ada as they talked through their boundaries and expectations moving forward, but deep down inside her mind echoed warnings about crossing lines that could change everything.
Thank you for watching this spellbinding African tale. We'd love to know where you're joining us from around the world. Share your thoughts and your country in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more enchanting and captivating African stories.